Hey guys, tonight we venture gently into the hushed stone halls of a medieval convent, where candlelight flickers against thick walls and woolen habits whisper with every movement. Picture yourself strolling slowly past cloistered archways and narrow corridors, where the scent of beeswax and old parchment hangs in the still air. You're wrapped in the quiet rhythm of monastic life, chanting, prayer, the soft rustle of parchment being turned in a scriptorium. All seems orderly, holy. And then you spot something odd. A nun passes silently, her hands folded into her sleeves in the classic pose of humility. And yet, there it is. The sleeve twitches, just a flicker, subtle as a breeze. You blink, another twitch, then the unmistakable squirm of something light and sinuous. Not a trick of the candlelight. Definitely not divine intervention. That nun, serene as an icon, has something alive and fidgety stashed up her sleeve. And that's how you meet tonight's unlikely historical subject. The humble, squirmy, sleep-curled sleeve ferret. You probably wouldn't last an hour in this convent. By the way, no modern plumbing, strict silence at meals, and the ever-present danger of stepping barefoot on a roaming weasel with a strong sense of entitlement and a fondness for biting toes. But we'll take things slow, with no vows required. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know, what's your local time? And where in the world are you listening from? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move gently through the cloister garden, where rosemary and rue grow low along the stone path. The wind is quiet, carrying the smell of wool and wood smoke. A small group of nuns shuffle by in their long habits, sleeves heavy and trailing. It seems like a lot of sleeve for such a small wrist. And now you know why. In the dim alcove of a scriptorium, where books are copied by hand, one sister pauses. She tucks her quill behind her ear, lifts her arm slightly, and a pink nose peeks out from the voluminous wool. A moment later, a long, silky head emerges, sniffs the air, and nuzzles the edge of her cheek before retreating again. Not a demon, not a vision, just her little friend. You may be asking, why? Well, that's exactly what we'll be exploring tonight, in gently unfolding detail. The ferret, or its wild cousin, the polecat, was not uncommon in the medieval world. People knew them mostly as pest control quick, efficient, and startlingly wriggly little rat catchers. But how they ended up as unofficial convent companions is one of those tiny, delightful footnotes of history you won't find in many textbooks. These ferrets weren't just tolerated. They were, in some places, and at certain times, embraced. Historians still argue whether it was out of practical necessity, personal fondness, or a quiet rebellion against the strictures of cloistered life. But what's undeniable is that they made their way into the sleeves of some of the most reserved women in Europe. And those sleeves weren't just fashion statements. They were long, warm, and perfect for a slender animal to nestle into in a time when stone walls held on to the cold and winter prayers began before sunrise. Having a wriggly little fur-covered hot water bottle tucked discreetly by your side was a secret comfort. You trail behind another nun through the herb garden. She kneels to tend a cluster of marigolds, and as she bends, a tiny ferret tail flicks out from her sleeve before disappearing like a drawn curtain. She doesn't react. Neither does anyone else. It's just another day in the convent. Of course, not all religious orders allowed animals. Some were stricter than others, but clever sisters often found quiet ways to justify their presence. Ferrets caught mice. Mice ate grain. Grain was for baking. Eucharistic bread. See? It's all perfectly spiritual. If you squint a little, others may have simply needed companionship. Life in the convent could be lonely, especially for young girls sent there, not by calling, but by family arrangement. A warm little creature with beady eyes and a playful personality may have been more than a pet. It was a friend, one you could sneak a bit of dried meat to under the table, one that didn't talk back during silent hours, one that never judged you for re-inking your pen 4 times before writing the word Amen. You pause at the edge of the chapel now. The nuns file in, candles in hand, shadows stretching across the floor. And as they bow their heads in prayer, you see it again, a little face peeking out from a sleeve, looking around, as if wondering whether it, too, must chant the Psalms. Tonight, we'll go deeper. You'll learn about the shape of sleeves and how they were just right for ferret travel. You'll hear about vermin infestations in sacred spaces. You'll witness a few saintly debates over what constitutes proper monastic behavior and whether a ferret counts as a moral failing or a minor miracle. But for now, just keep walking, keep listening. There's a whole world of sleepy, squeaky history tucked under those sleeves. You walk slowly now, following the rhythm of soft sandals across cold stone, letting your mind settle into the quiet pulse of medieval convent life. The walls rise high on either side, thick and weathered, holding in centuries of whispered prayers, scratched ink, and yes, unexpected pets. The nunnery wakes early, before the sun dares peek over the hills. Bells chime gently through the mist. You hear the low murmurs of matins' morning prayers that begin in darkness before the warmth of the day has a chance to arrive. Inside the chapel, the sisters move in a slow current, their voices layering over one another like fog. You take your place among them, invisible and silent, and let your eyes wander to the line of habits ahead. Their sleeves are vast, hanging low, stitched wide, trailing like boat curtains. In some orders, these sleeves were both symbol and tool, signs of humility and simplicity. Yes, but also terribly convenient pouches. A sister might carry a scrap of cloth for polishing chalices, a needle and thread for mending, or, as we're here, to enjoy the subtle warmth of a living ferret dozing against her forearm. The rules, as with most things, medieval, were both strict and oddly flexible. You couldn't own property. You couldn't wear color. You weren't supposed to enjoy comfort. But a creature that made no noise served a practical purpose and kept the chill from turning your fingers blue. That, some argued, was God's quiet mercy. The convent was a paradox, simultaneously, a place of intense structure and small indulgences. You'd think silence would dominate, but convents were rarely truly quiet. Quills scratched parchment, pots clanged in the kitchens, and when you least expected it, the chirp of a startled ferret came muffled from someone's sleeve, followed by a sheepish cough, and the sound of someone pretending to be fascinated by a prayer book. You peer into the kitchen, where the scent of barley porridge thickens the air. A nun stirs the pot with one hand, the other tucked deeply into her opposite sleeve. Her arm shifts slightly, as though something inside has just wriggled. You notice a small paw pop out for half a second before disappearing again. She doesn't even blink, just keeps stirring. Historians paint monastic life as dull, repetitive, deeply spiritual. And to be fair, that's not wrong. But it was also full of little mischiefs. Some nuns would sneak almonds into their cloaks for a treat during Lent. Others embroidered tiny symbols into their underrobes, and some, like our new favorite group, hid fur-covered companions in their habits with a sly grin and a prayer on their lips. Ferrets were particularly well suited to the monastic lifestyle. They didn't bark. They didn't need to be walked. They curled easily into a ball and stayed there for hours, content to sleep and softly snore. They ate little, fit into corners, and best of all, they earned their keep. You pause in the scriptorium now, watching as a scribe scratches carefully at parchment. A few feet away, a fellow sister pulls back the sleeve of her writing arm to dip a quill in ink, and as she lifts it, a sleepy creature clings gently to her forearm. Blinking slowly at the flickering candlelight, she smiles faintly and coos something in Latin that sounds suspiciously like baby talk. The pages they copy are long, and days are longer, but a fuzzy, fidgety friend is often just enough to keep things bearable. Some historians believe these animals helped stave off deeper loneliness. Others argue they were tolerated only because of their usefulness in controlling mice and rats, which chewed through stored grain, holy vestments, and the very manuscripts the nuns labored to preserve. Still, the truth likely lies somewhere in between. You don't name a tool, but you do name a pet, and these ferrets had names, not just ferret or beastie, but things like Clarissa, Nutmeg, St. Jude, or rather boldly, Baby Cheese, names whispered fondly into fur during long winter nights when the cloister winds crept in through cracks in the stone. You follow the sisters out into the garden after Tersa, the third prayer hour. The sun is warming the cobbles now, and the garden is waking damp rosemary, bending fennel, bees lazily investigating foxglove blooms. A sister tends to a patch of thyme, a little twitch of movement, betraying her hidden passenger. She pauses, chuckles softly, and whispers something into her sleeve before getting back to her weeding. You pass her slowly and catch the glint of a tiny pink nose from under her robe's hem. Not everyone approved, of course. Some abbots were horrified at the idea of animals unclean, distracting sharing sacred space. Rules were written, then quietly ignored. Letters were sent, then forgotten. One bishop, according to a gently exasperated note in the monastery records, tried to implement a ferret ban after tripping over one during an inspection. The ban, it seems, was lifted shortly after his departure, and so the nuns continued. They prayed, they gardened, they baked bread, and copied texts, and recited psalms. And quietly, without drama, they did it all, with a ferret curled against their ribs. Life was simple, repetitive, full of quiet labors and even quieter joys. And as the candles burn lower tonight, and your eyes begin to drift, you too can imagine the warmth of a tiny body curled gently in the crook of your arm, soft breath against your sleeve, anchoring you to the quiet, steady rhythm of a life once lived in stone and silence. Your walk slows as you make your way toward a narrower corridor, the stone beneath your feet, worn smooth by generations of sandals, bare soles, and the occasional fast-moving ferret. You pause near a wooden bench, tucked beneath a narrow window, the morning light slanting through thick glass and painting soft rectangles across the floor. From somewhere nearby, you hear the familiar rustle of robes, the faint clicking of wooden rosary beads, and a sound you're starting to recognize, a tiny, muffled sneeze. Not from a nun, definitely not. This is where the ferret enters the cloister. Not metaphorically, literally. You follow the sound to a small side chamber near the laundry yard. Inside, two nuns crouch next to a wooden crate, giggling softly. Yes, giggling, as one reaches in and pulls out a long, wiggly creature who immediately tries to crawl up her arm and into her sleeve. Nose first, she guides it expertly, her habit rumpling slightly as the creature disappears into its woolen tunnel. You'd think the arrival of a ferret in a place of such solemnity would be a grand event, but no. The truth is simpler and far more human. Ferrets, or rather domesticated polecats, were already common enough in the outside world. Farmers kept them to control mice in granaries. Hunters trained them to flush rabbits from burrows. They were small, adaptable, and astonishingly sneaky. And sometimes, when a girl joined the convent voluntarily, or not, she brought one along. Some came tucked into baskets of dowry cloths. Others were snuck in under cloaks. One particularly vivid account describes a young novice concealing her ferret in her hood for the entire journey to the abbey, claiming a nervous tic when it kept shifting around. Once inside, the animal would either be turned out or quietly adopted into the rhythm of cloistered life. It's not as if the convents were immune to pests, quite the opposite. Grain stores attracted rodents, as did the scraps from kitchens and the warmth of scriptoriums. Rats gnawed at precious books. Mice nested in the hems of habits. Ferrets, then, were a practical solution. But they weren't just mousers. You continue your stroll and pass the door to a novice's cell left ajar. It's tiny. A straw-filled pallet, a narrow table with a candle stub, a wooden cross on the wall, but nestled on the windowsill, stretched long in a patch of sun, lies a ferret, its back legs kicked out behind it, tail twitching in a dream. It wears a delicate collar made from a braided thread, possibly recycled from a worn-out cincture. The young nun is sitting on the floor nearby, humming faintly while mending a sock. She glances up, smiles softly at the sleeping creature, and doesn't say a word. You get the sense this is their daily routine. Ferrets were quick to adapt to life inside the convent, perhaps because they already embodied many of the same qualities valued by the church: silence, focus, minimal possessions, and an ability to wriggle into narrow, uncomfortable spaces with astonishing grace. Of course, not all ferrets behaved themselves. Some earned a reputation for thievery, stealing scraps of bread, bits of thread, even nibbling the edge of parchment in the library. One abbot reportedly complained that his sermon notes had been rearranged by a weasel, possessed of mischief and low cunning. Whether this was literal or metaphorical remains politely unclear. You stop again at the refectory, where a silent meal is in progress. The sisters eat in silence, as is the rule, but their eyes flicker with quiet amusement as one nun reaches into her sleeve and offers a sliver of cheese to a snout just poking out. The animal takes it delicately, retreats, and then, after a few moments, peeks out again in hope of dessert. Historians still argue whether ferrets were ever officially allowed within monastic walls. There are records that mention animals in cloisters. Cats in particular were often kept to manage rodents, but ferrets, their appearances in historical documents are few and mostly indirect. A bishop's complaint here, a margin note. There, no formal canon laws addressing them by name, which, conveniently, meant they could slip beneath notice. Much like themselves, their stealthy nature made them idle cloister companions. Not just practically, but socially, a nun could share her private space with a ferret without drawing much attention. They didn't bark. They didn't crow at dawn. They didn't need to be walked through the courtyard in full view of the abbess. They simply curled up in a sleeve or tucked into a robe, emerging now and then for affection, food, or mischief. You continue through the cloister garden now, where soft breezes stir the herbs planted in neat rows. A sister passes by, carrying a watering pot fashioned from clay, and as she bends to pour, a tiny nose peeks out from the crook of her arm and twitches at the scent of fresh mint. She pauses, whispers something funda and faintly ridiculous, then continues on, as if nothing strange had happened. That's the magic of these small moments. in the midst of silence and ritual, of strict rules and spiritual striving, there's a ferret stealing a button, a nun stifling a laugh, a quiet bond formed not out of rebellion, but out of simple, undeniable affection. It's easy to romanticize the past, or to reduce it to rules and rigidity. But you, tonight, get to witness the details that fall between the lines of the illuminated manuscript, the tiny, warm, wiggly truths that make history feel human. And as you walk toward Vespers, where the sisters will soon sing their way into evening, you hear it again, that soft chitter of a ferret waking up, and you smile. The sun begins to dip gently behind the slate roofs of the convent, casting long gold bars through the windows. You pass through a colonnade just as the evening breeze picks up, stirring the hems of habits and the corners of old parchments. It also stirs something else, a flash of movement under the wide sleeve of a nun, kneeling to light the evening candles. You watch as she straightens, cradling her elbow with her opposite hand, as if warming it, or perhaps keeping something nestled quietly in place. A small yawn escapes from within the wool. Not hers, definitely not hers. At this point in your journey, you've seen enough to understand these creatures weren't just tolerated. They were cherished, perhaps even essential, and not just emotionally, but functionally. Welcome to the unsung chapter of medieval pest control, the ferret as working nun inside the kitchen, where barley flour and dried beans fill burlap sacks. Mice are a constant nuisance. Rats, too, sometimes gnaw through the wooden bins that store almonds for feast days. You peek in just as a sister lifts the lid of a grain chest and, as said, instead of reaching for a scoop, she whistles softly down her sleeve. Within seconds, a slender, pale creature slinks out and drops into the chest, disappearing beneath the surface like a divine exorcist of crumbs. Ferrets were ideal for this work. Long, flexible spines allowed them to slip into the narrowest cracks. Their sharp noses could sniff out nests in walls and under floorboards, and their instincts, lethal. Give a ferret a scent trail and a small hole, and it becomes the nightmare of every monastery mouse. You follow this silent, whiskered soldier as it emerges triumphantly with a captured snack dangling from its mouth. The nun calmly takes the rodent, wraps it in cloth, and offers her companion a sliver of egg yolk as thanks. No fuss, no squeals, no dramatic cries of unclean, just one more task, handled in the rhythm of daily life. In colder months, the role of the ferret shifted from hunter to heater. These stone walls did little to keep out the chill, and most convents didn't exactly have roaring hearths in every room. Heating was expensive, firewood scarce, but the body heat of a small, furred animal could make all the difference. You peek into a novice's quarters, where a sister lies on her narrow cot, wrapped in wool and murmuring evening prayers, curled into the hollow at her side, under a blanket and half under her robe. is her ever-present ferret, nose tucked beneath its tail. Her breathing slows, the candle burns low, and the creature stays there, perfectly still, like a breathing hot stone, wrapped in fur. It's a fact of medieval life that warmth wasn't just comfort, it was survival. Nuns relied on layered garments, herb-filled bed warmers, and anything else that could take the edge off a February morning in a stone cell. Some convents issued hand warmers or heated bricks wrapped in linen, but a ferret, that was warmth that snuggled back. Historians still debate whether the primary role of these ferrets was pest control or companionship. Some argue for utility. The animals earned their keep by catching mice and minimizing food waste. Others suggest the line between tool and pet was already blurred in medieval minds. After all, these were women who embroidered flowers into veils and named their favorite cheese. You think they weren't going to get a little attached to a sleepy creature curled around their wrists? Then again, not all orders were so tolerant. Some abbesses banned animals entirely, fearing that affection for such companions might soften spiritual resolve. Others enforced strict rules about property. Nothing owned, nothing named. Still, enforcement was inconsistent, and where there's a will and a warm sleeve, there's a way. In some regions, it was common for ferrets to be passed down informally from sister to sister. When a nun took her final vows or passed away, her little friend might be adopted by another. There are even whispers, half myth, half memoir, of ferrets attending funerals, peeking out from sleeves during the final prayers. You imagine it now, a circle of black-clad sisters singing a slow psalm beneath the cold sky, a tiny whiskered face glancing out from a grieving wrist. It sounds like fiction, but then again, history is often just reality with slightly better lighting. Some convents went even further, crafting simple gear for their companions. Tiny collars woven from spare wool, bells made from bits of broken rosaries, leather harnesses stitched with scrap thread. You even hear of one ferret outfitted with a velvet ribbon during the feast of St. Francis, a patron of animals. Of course, though no one ever admitted who tied it on, you pause beside a wooden bench near the refectory. A nun sits quietly, hands folded, face serene. Her sleeve stirs, and a small paw stretches out and bats lazily at the edge of her cuff. She gently tucks the paw back inside and murmurs a prayer, not of frustration, but of calm. The creature retreats, and she smiles without moving her lips. The air smells of rosemary and wood ash. The bell for Compline night prayers has not yet rung, and the convent holds its breath in the pause between duties. Even the ferrets seem to sense it, curled up, sighing in the language only soft creatures know. Tomorrow will be another day of prayers, work, and hidden little feet. But for now, you stay here a moment longer, quietly watching the last glow of sun slide across the floor, and in the quiet sleeve of one nun's robe, the day ends with a wiggle and a yawn. The sky has turned from honey gold to to a muted slate as evening settles fully over the convent. You follow the dim flicker of lanterns through the main corridor, past arched doorways and shuttered alcoves. The walls whisper with echoes, the scraping of wooden chairs, a distant cough, the low rustle of wool. Then, as you round a corner, you notice something very peculiar. It's a group of habits hung neatly on pegs outside the novices' dormitory. Nothing strange there, except one of the sleeves is visibly twitching. You step closer. It twitches again, not dramatically, just enough to say, "Hello, I am alive, and I am very cozy." You resist the urge to laugh. You've stumbled upon one of the great, quiet wonders of medieval design, the extra-long, wide-sleeved garment, practically a weasel condo. Medieval. Nun habits varied from region to region and order to order, but the general structure had familiar features: woolen robes in dark colors, high collars, heavy hoods, and of course, sleeves large enough to double as carry-on luggage. While not designed for animal storage, they proved remarkably convenient for that purpose. Nonetheless, you pause in a washroom where a nun carefully scrubs the hem of her habit with a brush carved from bone. Her sleeves hang low as she works, and every so often she gives a little shake, not to shake water off, but to readjust the dozing ferret inside. When she lifts one arm to wring out the cloth, the shape of her little companion shifts beneath the fabric like a tiny ghost stretching after a nap. Fashion met function in strange ways during the Middle Ages. Unlike the sleek, tailored sleeves of modern dress, these were designed to keep the body warm, to signal humility, and, very likely, unintentionally, to accommodate all manner of secret stowaways. Thread spools, morsels of food, small tools, and the occasional living heat source with whiskers. In colder climates, sleeves might be lined with additional wool or fur. One chronicler described the nuns of a northern convent who stitched dried lavender into the lining of their sleeves, not for scent, but to deter bugs. Still, you can't help but imagine the bonus effect that might have had on a sleepy ferret curling up inside. Aromatherapy, medieval style. You stroll past the sewing room now. Candles burn low, illuminating nimble fingers stitching hoods and habits. One nun pauses in her embroidery to softly stroke something nestled just under the crook of her arm. You see it, a flash of cream-colored fur and a flick of a tail before it vanishes back into its woolen nest. She smiles faintly and returns to her stitches, humming just above a whisper. Historians have noted that these oversized sleeves were sometimes used for more mischievous purposes. 2. There are records vague, but insistent of nuns smuggling in extra biscuits, love notes, yes, even in cloisters. And once, in the case of a particularly bold Italian sister, a stolen copy of a banned psalter, all hidden in sleeves. Whether ferrets fell into this same gray area is open to scholarly debate. Some say they were allowed openly in certain convents, as long as they served a function. Others argue that they were smuggled in discreetly, tolerated only because they didn't draw attention. But most agree, if the sleeve moved and no one screamed, it probably wasn't a sin. You stop now at the edge of a cloister garden. Moonlight washes the square in cool blue light. A sister sits beneath an archway, arms crossed inside her sleeves, her face tilted skyward. A faint clicking sound breaks the silence. Tiny claws on wool. Her expression doesn't change, but her sleeve squirms slightly as the ferret inside rearranges itself for a better sleeping position. The garment doesn't sag. It doesn't bulge unnaturally. That's the beauty of the habit's design. The sleeves were made not just to cover, but to envelop, to obscure, and if one happened to gently conceal a 16-inch, noodle-shaped mammal who smelled faintly of hay and ink, well, who would know? You lean against a cool column and watch. It's not a big moment, not a clash of kings or a grand religious schism. It's quieter than that. Just one woman, one animal, and a sleeve that shifts now and then, like a lullaby, rocking slowly back and forth. The sisters begin filing past you, their shadows long and ghost-like under the moon. As they walk, a few sleeves twitch. One gently bumps into a passing shoulder. No one reacts. No one giggles. This is routine now. This is normal. It's easy to forget that history isn't only made by the loud and the large. Sometimes it's stitched into seams, curled in wool, and hidden in folds. The shape of a sleeve, the angle of a seam, it's all part of a world built slowly, lovingly, and sometimes with a warm little secret tucked inside. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine the texture of thick wool, the gentle weight of a creature sleeping against your wrist, the feeling of shared silence between two beings who, for very different reasons, both chose a life of enclosure, one for prayer, one for naps. Both, it seems, found the perfect sleeve. The moon rides high now above the cloistered walls, casting quiet silver across the flagstones. As you drift toward the Psalter room, it's quieter than the chapel, but not quite as still as the garden. The faint rustle of parchment blends with the occasional soft snort of a sleeping scribe or her less than human companion. You step through the wooden door, careful not to creak it, and enter the heart of the convent's intellectual life. Here is where the sisters study, memorize, copy, and pray over the holy texts. Rows of narrow desks line the room, each equipped with inkwells, candle stubs, and stacks of vellum. The air is thick with the smell of beeswax and aging hide-bound books, and also, curiously, with the faint musk of ferret. As you move slowly past the scribes at their work, you notice something, a small trail of tiny claw marks across the edge of one parchment, a careless error, a clumsy quill. No? There are faint paw prints leading to the corner of the desk, where a curled-up ferret is using the edge of the Psalter as a pillow. The nun doesn't seem to mind. She pauses in her transcription, scratches the creature behind its ears, and resumes copying with steady, practiced strokes. Her sleeve shifts slightly as she dips her quill, the motion causing the ferret to stretch, yawn, and settle again into sleep. Rodents were the bane of any medieval library. They gnawed at parchment, shredded bindings for nesting material, and occasionally used rare volumes as latrines. So having a creature around with a taste for mice, that wasn't just allowed, it was considered prudent. You glance down and notice a pair of slippers under the desk. Not shoes, slippers, as in indoor wear, comfort in a convent. Scandalous, perhaps, or maybe just practical. As with many things here, the line between rule and adaptation is blurrier than parchment soaked in rain. The Psalter Room, as it turns out, had an ongoing war with rats for centuries. Monastic records from more than one abbey describe infestations so bad that entire shelves of sacred texts had to be recopied due to rodent damage. In one particularly tragic tale, a rare illuminated gospel was chewed through in the center, leaving a ferret-shaped hole in the abbey's history. Or at least, that's how the sisters told it afterward. That might have been when the ferrets became more than tolerated. They became vital. Not every nun welcomed them, though one stern entry in a convent's rulebook refers to the unacceptable practice of sisters giving names to beasts during daylight hours. The rule is oddly specific, too specific. Someone definitely called their ferret brother Jerome, and someone else definitely tattled. Historians still argue whether ferrets were ever given an official role in monastic records. They were too useful to ban outright, but too mischievous to be listed in the guest book. One scholar writes that they were the convent's open secret, much like the occasional contraband cheese wheel or the shared romance poems hidden inside prayer books. You pause beside a writing desk where an older nun, perhaps the prioress herself, is carefully illuminating the margins of a page. Her brush strokes are delicate, precise, and in the border of the parchment, winding among the vines and flowers, is a tiny golden ferret, stylized, of course, but unmistakable. It's one of the few visual records of these creatures you're likely to find. While cats appeared frequently in medieval manuscripts, ferrets were more elusive, much like their real-life counterparts. But every now and then, in the twist of a vine or the curl of a decorative tail, you catch a glimpse, a wink, a reminder. Even the architecture shows signs of adaptation. Some scriptoriums had low drawers built into the desks, not for pens or ink, but lined with scraps of linen, soft beds, small nests, perfect for a curled-up companion. You rest your hand lightly on one such drawer, and as if summoned, a tiny snout pokes out, followed by a pair of bright eyes. The ferret blinks once, as if evaluating your usefulness, then retreats back into its makeshift burrow with the slow dignity of a monk returning to prayer. The nun at the desk doesn't look up. She simply murmurs, "He prefers the warm ones," and returns to her work. These creatures weren't pets in the modern sense. They weren't coddled or babied, not out loud anyway. They were helpers, colleagues, even part of the rhythm, the cycle of work and worship. Like candles, they lit the cold. Like parchment, they bore the marks of the sacred and the mundane. You walk on, past more desks, more dim faces in the candlelight. Some nuns hum quietly as they work, the sound barely audible above the scratch of quills and the occasional soft chirp from a tucked-away sleeve. You notice one sister pressing her lips together to suppress a laugh as her ferret tries to crawl down the front of her robe mid-sentence. The joy is subtle, but it's there, beneath the rule, beneath the veil, beneath the repetition of psalms. There's life, movement, whimsy as you approach the far end of the room. You find a shelf stacked with older, worn books, ones no longer in active use, but too sacred to discard. And tucked into the corner, nestled between two forgotten volumes, is a small knitted pouch. You touch it gently and find it still lined with rabbit fur, long flattened from years of little naps. No one's used it in decades, but no one's removed it either. Some habits are hard to break, and as you step back into the hallway, the quiet behind you deepens not with silence, but with memory, with the faint scent of vellum and ferret musk, with the char echo of lives lived slowly, rhythmically, warmly, with sleeves that held not just books or quills, but tiny, wriggling chapters of joy. The cool stone corridor gives way now to an archway leading out into the cloister courtyard, bathed in pale moonlight and hushed anticipation. You feel it, the sacred stillness that wraps these walls after Compline, when the nuns retreat into a softer silence, the kind that folds around you like wool and gently refuses to be disturbed, except, of course, for the quiet sound of claws scampering across flagstones. You turn your head just in time to see a blur of fur zip from shadow to shadow, pause beside a potted lavender bush, then vanish behind the columned arcade. A few seconds later, a nun emerges from the opposite direction. She's calm, hands folded in her wide sleeves, face serene, but if you listen carefully, you can hear the faintest jingling from her right wrist, something small, with a bell perhaps. This brings us to the quietly ridiculous, yet completely plausible question of, were the ferrets really just for pest control? Or did the sisters actually enjoy them? You walk with her through the cloister, matching her soft pace. The rhythm of her sandals seems to lull the stone itself to sleep. She pauses by a bench and sits, resting her elbow on the armrest. Her sleeve bulges slightly, then wiggles, then sneezes. She lifts the edge of her sleeve and whispers, "Not now," with the same tone one might use for a talkative toddler during Mass. And you realize, yes, these animals were more than mousers. They were, in many cases, deeply cherished companions in a world where touch was rare, warmth was fleeting, and solitude was the rule. A tiny, warm creature who curled up beside you without judgment was something quietly miraculous. Many nuns entered the convent very young. Some as children, others as teenagers, pledged by their families. For many, cloistered life meant saying goodbye not only to the world outside, but to physical affection. No embraces, no hand-holding, no idle touch. And yet, here was something soft and living that could nestle under your chin while you prayed. You glance into a dormitory chamber now, where straw mattresses line the floor in quiet order. One nun lies awake, her eyes open, but unfocused. Staring toward the wooden rafters, she shifts slightly, and from beneath her blanket, a small head emerges. The ferret blinks once, then burrows gently into the crook of her neck. She sighs, closes her eyes, and lets herself sleep. Historians still argue whether such intimacy was truly allowed. Some monastic rule books made vague references to unfit attachments, but definitions varied. A few orders went so far as to ban non-utilitarian animals, though enforcement was tricky, and frankly, the nuns were clever when questioned. A sister might insist that the animal was essential for catching mice, that it prevented spoilage, that it was shared communally, and in many cases, all of those things were true. But you don't knit a pouch from leftover wool scraps and line it with fleece unless you're thinking about comfort, about softness and safety. You step through the far doorway into the cloister's warming room, the only chamber where an open hearth is kept burning through the cold months. Several nuns are gathered here, not speaking, but simply sitting in the warmth. One mends a veil, another cleans a wooden comb, a third strokes something hidden in her sleeve, so gently that you almost miss it. A tail flicks once, a paw stretches, claws curling in the air, then it retreats again. She smiles, barely. For some sisters, the presence of a ferret may have felt like a link to their previous lives. Childhood homes, country estates, or small villages where animals were part of daily life, bringing that memory into the convent, however quietly, may have softened the transition from one world to the next. And for others, it was a spiritual act in itself. Saint Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of animals, was a popular figure across religious orders. His sermons to birds and affection for all living things made him a model of gentle communion. For a nun to care for a ferret, to feed it, to stroke its fur, and to whisper morning prayers with a snout nestled in her sleeve. This wasn't rebellion. This was stewardship. You continue to a stairwell now, lit only by a faint candle at the bottom. As you descend, you imagine how often these creatures must have darted ahead of the sisters on their way to morning prayers, slipping like smoke beneath door frames, getting underfoot, disappearing into the laundry, and emerging hours later, covered in wool lint. Not all clergy saw the humor. There are dry complaints preserved in abbey records, mentions of vermin mistaken for vestments, and one sharply worded letter describing a feral beast tangled in the cincture of Sister Aurelia. No resolution is listed, only the note, resolved quietly by the sacristan. You get the sense Aurelia won that round. Some nuns even left behind brief, almost confessional, mentions of their creatures in marginal notes scrawled in the empty corners of prayer books. You've seen them tonight. Tiny drawings of long-bodied animals, initials beside paw prints, even verses of affection disguised as psalms, like "Blessed is she who shares her bread," even with the creature of claws and sleep. That verse wasn't found in any gospel, but it was penned in a novice's own hand, in ink barely visible under candlelight. You return once more to the garden before bed. The herbs sway in the soft wind, and the fountain gurgles gently nearby. A sister walks past, her arms folded, the shape of something gently breathing against her side. You notice now how instinctively they cradle their elbows, how their arms curve to protect the furred passengers they carry. It's no longer surprising. It's quietly lovely. And as the final bell of the night sounds through the convent, you realize you've seen something rare. Not just history, but humanity stitched into the folds of a woolen sleeve. The final bell fades into the stone as you drift toward the dormitory again. The sisters have begun settling in for the night, the rhythm of the convent shifting into its slowest, sleepiest cadence. From behind each wooden door comes the rustle of linen robes, the creak of straw-stuffed mattresses, and the unmistakable hush of whispered night prayers. But you, of course, are listening for something else. There, it is a faint, high-pitched chirr, then another, the soft sound of a ferret dreaming. And not just one. You peek through a barely cracked door and catch a glimpse of what might be the most medieval bedtime ritual you've ever seen. A young nun lies curled beneath her blanket, the heavy wool tucked just beneath her chin. Her hand emerges from under the covers, gently tapping the hem of her sleeve. In response, a long, furry shape slithers its way up her arm, nose first, burrowing deep beneath the robe. Her eyes close. A final sigh. They fall asleep together. You see, ferrets weren't just midday distractions or rodent wranglers. They became part of the rhythm of sleep itself. Tiny, breathing hot water bottles that nestled into the crooks of knees, the hollows of elbows, and sometimes even beneath hoods, where the scalp felt coldest in the zone. Chilled dormitory. It's easy to forget that sleep in the medieval world wasn't always restful. Beds were often shared or narrow. Pillows were stuffed with straw or bundled rags, and nights were cold, bitterly cold, especially in convents that forbade excessive bedding as a sign of spiritual discipline. So what's a spiritually committed, yet deeply freezing nun to do? Answer: she tucks a warm-bellied ferret into her sleeve, folds her arms tightly across her chest, and lets the soft, purring weight of it lull her into peace. You move now down the hallway, where the dormitory cells line both sides, like the pages of a book. Each cell is simple: a wooden bed, a crucifix, a single candle or lamp, and perhaps a folded bit of extra cloth for chillier nights. Yet here and there, you catch signs of personalization. A pouch stitched with initials, a sprig of dried lavender hung by the door, a tiny wooden carving perched near a window, and sometimes, if you listen carefully, a squeak or shuffle beneath the blanket. Historians still debate how common this practice truly was. Was it widespread across Europe or limited to a few eccentric convents? Were the animals passed around like shared tools or closely guarded like treasures? The records are inconsistent, but the evidence, archival and anecdotal, makes one thing clear: where there was warmth to be found, it was cherished. A nun in 14th century Brittany wrote in her journal of the creature that shares my breath and never interrupts my prayers. Another, from a German convent, referred to her ferret as my silent sister. And while these lines are brief, buried between pages of prayer lists and fasting notes, they speak volumes. Of course, not everyone was on board. Some abbess feared that too much affection for a ferret could distract from spiritual discipline. One order attempted to restrict contact, declaring that animals must never share the sleeping space of the sacred, but the rule was unenforceable. Ferrets are small. Nuns were creative, and once you've known the comfort of a warm, furry coil beneath your blanket, you're unlikely to give it up for doctrine alone. You step lightly into one of the larger, shared sleeping quarters. Now, where 3 sisters lie in beds arranged neatly along the walls. All 3 are asleep or close to it. One murmurs softly, her fingers twitching as if stroking a dream. Another shifts under her blanket and emits a quiet laugh. Just once, her ferret, apparently, has chosen to crawl across her stomach. Mid-snooze, at the foot of each bed, is a tiny basket, some whole. Old spare veils. Others, you notice, contain rags, herbs, and what look like toys. A ball of knotted string, a carved bit of wood in the shape of a mouse. The sisters aren't just caretakers of these creatures. They are, in a very quiet, very sleepy way, doting guardians. One nun even kept a diary rare in a convent and included an inventory of what she called her pouchlings' needs. The list reads like a shopping list from the gentlest medieval apothecary: fresh hay, trimmed nails, thyme oil, old ribbon. She ends with the line, "He likes the corner of my pillow best," but only after lauds. You smile. You can't help it. Sleep is sacred in the cloister, not just for rest, but for rhythm. It's the final retreat of the day, and sharing that time with a soft, living presence must have felt like a small mercy, granted nightly by a quiet God. There's even a theory, yes, one hotly contested, that some nuns preferred ferret company over the traditional wooden crucifix placed near the bed. Not because they loved their ferret more, but because the comfort it gave felt more immediate, more real. One was a symbol of divine love. The other was a living expression of it, in warmth and breath and gently twitching paws. You reach the end of the corridor now. A heavy door opens onto a stairwell leading to the bell tower. It's unused at night, cold and echoing. Yet, when you climb it, step by creaking step, and open the hatch to the rooftop, you're met with a sight worth braving the draft. The convent stretches below you, like a storybook map. Rooftops, gardens, tiny windows glowing gold, a few flickers of candlelight still dot the halls, but most have gone dark. Most are sleeping, and below each sleeping sister, perhaps nestled in an elbow, perhaps curled up on a folded veil, is a creature whose warmth was never mentioned in sermons, but felt in the bones as the wind curls around your shoulders and the stars shimmer above. You find yourself strangely soothed. The nuns were never alone. Not truly. Even in their most private hours, in the stillness of night, they had something close, something soft, something real. And tonight, so do you. The stars press deeper into the ink of the sky as you descend quietly from the bell tower, your feet finding familiar rhythms on each cool stone step below. The convent has settled into complete silence. Its kind of silence, which is never really silent. There are always soft creaks, distant breaths, a faint sniffle here, the shuffling of fabric there, and if you listen closely enough, the tiniest scuffle of paws. You pass through the corridor again, now cloaked in shadow and flickering candlelight. One sister lingers by a narrow window, gazing out at the moonlight slipping across the tiles. You notice she's standing oddly, one arm folded tightly across her stomach. Then, without ceremony, a tiny head pokes out from the folds of her habit and gives a full-body yawn so dramatic it nearly topples the poor creature backward. She doesn't flinch. She just gently strokes the top of its head with one finger, nods slightly, and returns to her watch. Not all ferrets were quiet bed companions. Some were night wanderers, slipping from blankets and sleeves the moment their caretakers drifted into dreams. The medieval cloister was not designed with ferret containment in mind. There were no plastic enclosures or chew-proof cages. There were just hallways and cupboards and the occasional cat flap. If someone had been clever or reckless enough to install one, you turn now into the infirmary, a quiet, cool chamber lined with pallets and shelves of dried herbs. The smell is sharper here: rosemary, lavender, crushed sage, and something faintly medicinal. An elderly sister lies asleep beneath a woven blanket, her breaths shallow but steady. A younger nun sits beside her, head bowed, lips moving silently through prayers. But it's the ferret that catches your eye, nestled against the patient's ribs. It sleeps in sync with her each rise and fall of her chest, mirrored by the soft bounce of the little creature's fur. Its body curls perfectly to the curve of her side, a living comfort that no tincture or poultice could provide. This wasn't unusual. In many convents, ferrets found their way into infirmaries naturally, not as healers, obviously, but as warmth, as distraction, as peace. Historians point to letters written by abbesses, requesting small, tame companions to ease the suffering of aging or infirm sisters. One wrote, "It is the opinion of Sister Clare that the beast in her sleeve has reduced her cough by half. Whether this is medically accurate remains to be seen. But if belief and comfort count as medicine, and in medieval times they often did, then perhaps Sister Clare was on to something." You notice the small items scattered across the infirmary shelves. Carved wooden spoons, hand-stitched pouches, tiny bowls of mashed oat porridge. One corner even has a nesting basket lined with the fur of an old robe. Someone has drawn a little symbol in chalk beside it. A curled tail. The message is clear. This spot is reserved. Back in the hallway, a soft thud catches your ear. You pause, then see it, a ferret, tumbling down a single step, completely unbothered, then continuing its determined scurry down the corridor. A moment later, a nun appears in pursuit, clutching a half-eaten biscuit in one hand and muttering the medieval equivalent of, "Come back here, you little bread thief." This side of convent life, the silly, the absurd, is rarely preserved in formal chronicles, but it lived in the margins, in the ink-blotted drawings of playful creatures tucked into hymnals, in the footnotes about missing food or troublesome clawed ones, and in the memories passed between sisters when records faded. Not all interactions were gentle. Of course, ferrets, despite their charm, were independent little whirlwinds. They chewed hems, they stole scraps. They once dragged an entire rosary under a bed, piece by wooden bead, and they did not always respect silence during prayer. There's a story, dubious but delightful, of a ferret that escaped during morning mass and climbed up the folds of the altar cloth mid-sermon. The presiding sister reportedly finished her homily without blinking, even as the creature on the altar beside her and licked its paws. This, according to the unofficial convent gossip, earned her the nickname Saint Cecilia and the Weasel. Scholars are divided on whether this actually happened or if it's a much retold fable wrapped in admiration. But even if only a myth, it illustrates something important. These creatures weren't just tolerated. They were woven into the life and lore of the convent, like golden threads in a tapestry. You stroll now through the side chapel. The altar glows with faint moonlight, and a single candle burns before a small statue of the Virgin Mary. On the floor beside the votive stand lies a curled-up bundle, part blanket, part ferret. No one moved it. No one chased it off. Perhaps tonight it too is in prayer. Companionship in the convent took many forms through ritual, through letters, through shared labor, but none were quite so quietly physical, so instantly comforting as the warmth of a curled-up animal beside you in the dark. The medieval world understood suffering deeply. Weather, hunger, illness, and penance shaped daily life, but within those constraints, joy still found a way. A quiet laugh beneath a veil, a tiny snore echoing from a sleeve, a shared bit of bread nibbled in secret, and the knowledge that Even behind cloistered walls, in the coldest room, on the longest night, you might never be truly alone. You leave the chapel slowly now, trailing your fingers along the cool stone behind you. The ferret stirs, stretches, and tucks its head beneath its tail. Sleep returns like a tide. You follow it. The convent has drifted fully into slumber now, its corridors hushed, its candles flickering low in shallow niches. You walk softly through the refectory, where long wooden tables still bear the faint scent of earlier meals. Barley stew, fresh bread, and a faint note of thyme. But something else lingers here too. You smell it before you see it. The dry, musky whisper of fur. Under the farthest bench, half covered by a dropped linen napkin, a ferret dreams deeply, twitching one paw at a time in that frantic, silent way all small predators seem to do when they chase phantom prey through their dreams. You crouch low and watch as it snuffles against the floorboards. A moment later, a nun appears at the door with a small cloth bundle. She sets it gently on the bench and backs away. The creature stirs, noses the parcel, likely scraps from supper, and curls beside it, nose to fabric, already asleep again. In the refectory, food was sacred. It was portioned, shared, and consumed in silence. Talking during meals was discouraged, sometimes outright banned. Instead, the sisters listened to scripture, read aloud gospel passages, saints' lives, or, in one famously mischievous convent, a rotating series of morality tales that suspiciously resembled local gossip. So it may come as a surprise to learn that in many convents, the resident ferrets were allowed to roam freely during meals, not during formal feast days, of course, or when visiting clergy were present, but during the routine dinners and breakfasts of daily life. It wasn't uncommon to feel something brushing against your ankles. If you looked down and saw long fur and a tail, you simply shifted your robe and kept chewing. It was an unspoken arrangement. Ferrets cleaned up fallen crumbs. They kept mice from nesting beneath benches. And occasionally, yes, they distracted the sisters, usually by leaping onto a bench and attempting to steal a slice of cheese. Mid-blessing, that incident reportedly led to one sternly worded scroll reading, "Let no beast approach the bread unbidden." Historians still argue whether allowing animals in dining spaces was common or the result of lenient abbesses and quiet rebellion. Some argue it was strictly forbidden, but secretly allowed. Others believe that the cloister's emphasis on practicality made allowances in colder, rural regions where food waste meant attracting pests. Either way, the refectory's uninvited guests carved out a place of their own. You imagine the scene now, sisters eating in silence, a pair of tiny eyes peering from under the table, waiting for a dropped crumb of bread. A subtle motion as one nun dips her hand into her sleeve and withdraws a small morsel, sets it down by her foot, and never once breaks eye contact with the reader. An offering, a secret gift, a ritual of its own. Of course, not all ferrets behaved. There are records of one being locked in a pantry after it chewed through a wax-covered cheese wheel. Another, reportedly, tried to climb into the soup pot, prompting an entire table of nuns to leap to their feet and knock over every spoon in the process. That story, too, ends with a scolding, written in looping Latin script and preserved forever in the abbey's annals. Still, for every mischievous ferret, there were many more that simply curled beneath robes, gently snored under benches, and woke only when the scent of apples or smoked fish made the air too tantalizing to ignore. In one convent, the sisters developed a tradition of setting aside a creature's corner, a small cloth on the edge of the hearth where leftovers were gently placed after meals. The ferrets, familiar with the routine, would gather at the edges of the room as dinner ended, waiting like small, whiskered monks for their own blessing. You walk now through the adjoining kitchen, the ashes from the day's fire cooling slowly in the hearth. Pans hang from iron hooks, their copper dulled by smoke and time. A few dishes sit stacked in a tub of water. Tomorrow's chore. You catch movement beneath a cupboard. A small creature vanishes into shadow, tail flicking once. Even here, in the practical center of the convent, ferrets made their mark, sometimes literally, as paw prints in flour or muddy streaks across freshly scrubbed floors. The sisters may have grumbled, but many kept a little saucer set aside, not for themselves, but for the companions who had earned their scraps. And this, perhaps, is what's most remarkable, not the cuteness or the novelty, but the quiet way these animals were folded into the rhythm of sacred life. There were no ceremonies, no special titles, just the slow, wordless agreement between creature and caretaker. I will keep your bread safe from mice, and in return, you will not shoo me away when I nap beneath your skirts. You linger in the threshold as the kitchen darkens. Somewhere in the garden, an owl calls once, twice. Another candle flickers out, and beneath one of the cabinets, barely visible through the gloom, two eyes shine back at you, content, curious, and perhaps a little sleepy. The convent keeps its secrets well, but some secrets leave paw prints. You step lightly through the passage, leading toward the convent's modest library, your feet echoing on the worn stone tiles. The temperature shifts subtly. Here cooler, quieter, almost like the walls are holding their breath, out of respect for the centuries of stories tucked inside. Shelves rise along every wall, unevenly spaced, some leaning slightly under the weight of knowledge. You breathe in the scent of vellum, beeswax, and dust, and something fuzzier. You pause beside a low shelf stacked with manuscripts, and sure enough, nestled neatly between two volumes of translated saints' lives, is a sliver of fur and a rhythmic, twitching tail. The ferret doesn't seem to be reading. Then again, maybe it is, or maybe it's simply enjoying the way vellum warms under candlelight. This was the room where sisters copied and preserved sacred texts, engaged in personal reading, or pondered quietly with a single hand resting on their rosaries. You wander between the tables, each equipped with a candle holder, a quill, and if the sister was particularly fortunate, a cushion of wool wrapped in linen to rest her elbows. One such cushion is currently occupied not by elbows, but by a gently snoozing ferret, curled in a shape so perfect it could be a decorative flourish in the margin of a medieval manuscript. A sister nearby turns a page slowly, making no attempt to wake her companion. Instead, she shifts her book slightly to cast less shadow on his little resting place. Despite their chaos in other parts of the convent, ferrets in the library tended to be quieter. Perhaps it was the hush of the room. Perhaps it was the warmth of the candles. Or perhaps it was simply that this space invited a slower kind of time, one that suited nap-loving creatures particularly well. Interestingly, the relationship between books and beasts wasn't always adversarial. While mice were undeniably the enemy of any respectable library, animals that kept them away were, paradoxically, considered part of the preservation strategy. In some convents, ferrets were even brought in specifically during colder months to discourage rodents from burrowing near the book stacks. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or anecdotal. Some point to scratch marks found on surviving wooden bookcases as evidence that animals once prowled these literary halls. Others suggest those marks might just be from clumsy humans or over-enthusiastic quill testing. But one journal entry from a 13th century abbess is fairly clear. Better the noise of paws than the teeth of mice. You crouch now beside a reading desk where a younger sister scribbles in careful Latin. Her candle sputters slightly, casting gold light across the page. At her side, a ferret is stretched out across her lap like a luxurious sash, nose buried in the folds of her habit. Occasionally, she reaches down with one ink-stained finger to scratch between its shoulder blades, never pausing in her writing. You can almost hear her inner dialogue. Copy 2 lines. Scratch. Finish a psalm. Nudge the belly. Don't let him fall off your lap again like yesterday. There's a rhythm to it, a gentle, purring productivity. Some sisters, we know, became deeply attached to these animals. Marginalia, in surviving manuscripts, occasionally include doodles. A pair of long ears, here, a curly tail there. Once, in the corner of a book of hours, a full-body sketch of a ferret dancing with a monk, not necessarily realistic, but delightfully revealing. You walk past an open window now, the cool night air spilling across the floor. A breeze stirs the candle flames and causes one ferret nestled on a windowsill to roll dramatically onto its back in protest. It sprawls like a tiny emperor awaiting tribute. From beneath the table, a hand reaches up and gently pulls the window. Closed again. Peace is restored. These moments, small as they are, tell a story that rarely made it into the official record, not of saints or martyrs, but of domestic life, of care, mischief, and silent companionship. for nuns who had taken vows of silence, vows of enclosure, and vows of simplicity. A ferret may have been one of the few luxuries allowed a gift not of gold or jewels, but of warmth, whimsy, and a little breathing reminder that not all blessings arrived in the form of Latin prayers, and perhaps in their own quiet way. The sisters understood this. They didn't decorate altars with ferret statues or compose hymns in their honor, but they let them curl into their sleeves. They shared their heat, their scraps, and, more often than not, their most precious resource, attention. You step gently past a final shelf where a row of cracked spines leans at strange angles, like weary monks at vespers between two volumes. Barely visible in the candlelight are 4 little claw marks scratched lovingly into the wood. Not damage, a signature. You glide softly into the scriptorium again, retracing familiar steps beneath the ribbed arches and candlelit shadows. But tonight, your attention shifts from the hum of quills and paws to something even quieter, more hidden. You're here for the art, the margins, the secret corners of parchment, the places where nuns expressed themselves, not with words, but with tiny drawings that curled around the edges of their holy work, like whispered thoughts. You pull up a wooden stool and settle before a slanted writing desk. On the open page lies a careful rendering of the Virgin and Child, rich with cobalt and gold leaf, but it's not the central image that catches your eye. It's the edge of the page, where a delicate vine winds outward, spiraling around the frame, and nestled within the foliage is a creature far too elongated to be a cat, a ferret, crowned with a halo, wearing what appears to be a miniature nun's veil. You smile. Welcome to the curious world of marginalia. Medieval manuscripts were full of surprises, though the central illustrations focused on saints, battles, and sacred symbols. The margins often played host to rabbits, jousting on snails, monks fighting frogs, and birds playing musical instruments. But in convents especially, among the more artistically inclined sisters, marginalia also included tiny tributes to daily life, and for a surprising number of them, that meant ferrets. You page carefully through other manuscripts. In one, a slender creature dances atop a line of Latin text, tail forming the flourish beneath the final letter. In another, a group of ferrets surrounds a loaf of bread with suspiciously guilty expressions. One particularly cheeky nun even painted a ferret peeking out from beneath the hem of a bishop's robe, a detail so small it was nearly invisible without tilting the page. Just so, historians still debate how intentional these images were. Some believe they were private jokes meant to amuse the scribe during long hours of work. Others argue they served as subtle commentary, symbolic expressions of devotion, humility, or even rebellion. After all, to draw a weasel stealing bread on a page about charity might be a quietly humorous nudge at someone in the convent known to hoard her crusts. You lean closer to a different manuscript. This one, a book of hours filled with daily prayers. On one page, Alongside a psalm of praise is a tiny procession, 3 ferrets walking in single file. One, holding what looks like a daisy, another balancing a loaf of bread on its back, the third dragging a trailing ribbon in its teeth. Are they pilgrims, altar servers, or simply someone's fond memory committed to paint? In many ways, these drawings were the only places where a nun could leave behind a signature. Most convents forbade personal inscriptions or flourishes in formal texts, but the margins, those were loopholes, safe zones for affection, mischief, and the soft traces of personality, otherwise erased by silence and obedience. One famous example, preserved in a northern Italian abbey, is a psalter with a full-page illumination of Saint Bridget, but in the margin, a nun has drawn herself beside the saint, barely the height of a thimble, holding the leash of a ferret, wearing a bell collar. It's subtle, it's bold, it's unforgettable. You pause now, imagining that sister brush in hand, squinting by candlelight, heart racing slightly as she adds that final stroke. Would she be punished? Maybe, but would she be remembered? She already has been. It's not just books, either, in stained glass windows. Some convents included small depictions of animals among the saints and angels, often as symbolic stand-ins for virtues like humility or loyalty. And though the records rarely say so, several cloisters show creatures that are suspiciously long, low to the ground, and surrounded by rosemary vines. Coincidence? Doubtful. In one such window, still preserved today, a sister kneels in prayer, while a golden ferret curls beside her feet. No scroll explains it, no plaque names it, but the image remains quiet, luminous, and gently true. Not everyone approved. Of course, some clergy argued that such images were distractions. One bishop famously declared that the margins are for ivy, not for impudence. But the nuns, it seems, had a different view. They saw their ferrets not as comic relief, but as living companions worthy of ink, paint, and glass. You rise now and step into a side room, the illumination chamber, where pigments were ground and brushes stored. The scent of ground lapis and aged linseed oil lingers here. On a shelf lies a sketchbook, its edges frayed with age. Inside, tucked between pages of practice scrolls and floral patterns, you find doodles of paws, tails, even a ferret wearing spectacles. Probably wishful thinking. The artistry is uneven. Some drawings are delicate, others clumsy, but all are done with love. You imagine these sketches were made between tasks, during stolen minutes of calm, a flash of joy scratched into a world built on routine. And as you step back out into the scriptorium, the candlelight flickering low, you realize that history isn't just written in grand events or noble deeds. Sometimes it curls around a page, hides in a sketch, or wiggles in a sleeve. The ferrets may be long gone, but their tiny footprints inked, painted, and etched into the margins of memory remain. You slip into the cloister garden again, following the faint perfume of night-blooming herbs. The moon has shifted higher now, silvering the garden paths, and the stones are still warm from the day's sun. You trail your fingers across rosemary bushes and tangled thyme, brushing the scent onto your fingertips. The garden is quiet, but not entirely still. From beneath a hedgerow, a delicate rustle. Then, with the stealth of a shadow, a sleek little creature darts across the flagstones and disappears under a bench, tail curling like a question mark. You follow slowly, but another motion draws your eye. Not one, but 3 sets of eyes blink back at you from various corners of the garden. Ferrets, yes, but not alone. There's a squirrel halfway up the fig tree, chittering softly at the creatures below. In the distance, under the low branches of an olive tree, something fluffy and unusually round shuffles toward a patch of dandelions. A lamb. You blink. No, not a lamb. A very plump rabbit, wearing what appears to be a blue ribbon. So it turns out, our ferret friends weren't the only non-human residents of medieval convents. Many sisters kept pets, or at least semi-tamed animal companions, tucked into corners of convent life where they could offer comfort without drawing too much scrutiny. Birds, especially, were popular. Songbirds were kept in small cages or allowed to perch on windowsills during the day. Doves, finches, and the occasional raven. Even the feathered variety of friend found a home behind the cloister walls. You recall the story of a nun in 15th century Burgundy who trained a jackdaw to mimic the bell for evening prayers. It became so skilled that the abbess reportedly confused it more than once and nearly rescheduled Compline by mistake. The jackdaw, of course, was delighted. The abbess, slightly less so. Historians still argue whether these creatures were tolerated or simply quietly ignored. Many orders had rules against keeping pets, particularly if they were seen as distractions from devotion, but enforcement varied widely. Some abbesses were strict. Others were themselves suspected of slipping leftover bread to a particularly adorable hedgehog. You now pass the garden's far edge, where a shallow basin collects rainwater. A sparrow dips its head to drink. Beside the basin, a tiny wooden platform, likely built for devotional statues, now hosts a curled-up cat, one eye lazily open. Cats, of course, were the most controversial of the convent creatures. In some eras, they were considered sacred protectors of manuscripts and storerooms. In others, they were maligned as unclean or even diabolical. But in practice, most convents valued a cat's mouse hunting skills enough to overlook their theological baggage. The ferrets, meanwhile, seemed to exist in their own category. Part pet, part tool, part unruly roommate. But if we take a moment to look beyond them, we see a quiet network of animal presence winding through cloister life, not always visible, not always allowed, but always there. In one convent's records, a nun named Sister Petronilla was reprimanded for sharing her bed with an excess of softness. The entry doesn't name the creature, but accompanying sketches in the margin depict both a rabbit and something that may be a very fat guinea pig. We may never know for certain. What we do know is that she appealed the punishment and won. You make your way into a side courtyard now, where a low stone wall separates the medicinal herb garden from the apiary. That's right, bees, kept not as pets, but as vital members of the community. Their honey was used for healing, their wax for candles, their buzzing presence, a reminder that even tiny wings could serve God. And yet, there are records of nuns giving names to their favorite bees. One sister allegedly recited prayers aloud while watching them pollinate marigolds. Another claimed that a bee once followed her during a midday walk, which she interpreted as a sign to switch duties from kitchen work to gardening. People see what they need in animals, companionship, symbolism, solace for nuns who gave up so many forms of worldly comfort. These creatures filled a space that Scripture could not always reach. You walk again through the cloister halls. In the lintel above the kitchen door, you notice something you missed before, a carving of a bird and a squirrel, nestled together in a nook of ivy. Not grand, not official, but deliberate. It's the quiet kind of history, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but waits patiently to be noticed. You duck into a stairwell, and your gaze lands on a discarded basket at the bottom step. Inside, a ball of wool, a gnawed scrap of linen, and what looks suspiciously like a feather collection. Ferret handiwork, maybe, or perhaps a collaborative effort. Either way, the sisters clearly tolerated more than just the two-legged faithful. As you return to the garden's center, the ferrets have gathered again, this time in a tangle of legs and tails beneath a bench. Above them, two doves coo from a stone ledge, and a mouse, brazen as anything, darts between their sleeping bodies like a creature born of equal parts faith and folly. No one speaks, no one scolds. The nuns, if they're watching, have long since accepted this menagerie as part of the rhythm of cloister life. And as the stars pulse gently overhead, you wonder if maybe that's the real miracle here. Not the presence of animals in sacred space, but the simple human willingness to welcome them. You step away from the garden, now steeped in the heavy stillness of the early morning hours, and make your way through a narrow passage you haven't explored yet. The stones here are colder, the air tinged with something less fragrant than rosemary or beeswax. Something older. The rhythm of the convent has changed. It's slower now, more solemn, like a long exhale at the end of a chapter. You emerge into a modest archive room, its shelves lined with bundled scrolls and brittle ledgers. This is where the convent keeps its records: births and deaths, repairs and donations, and the careful chronicles of daily life. You skim a shelf, pausing on a faded leather binding with a title that translates roughly to "Things Worth Noting, Should Anyone Care." Naturally, you open it. Inside, you find not miracles or martyrdoms, but lists of missing vegetables, lists of unusual weather, lists of events involving animals. And here on a page, that curls faintly at the edges, you spot a heading written in strong, looping script. Disruptions caused by creatures of fur or feather. Send. You smile. The entries are small, unembellished, but full of sleepy charm. Ferret in laundry pile again. 4th time this month. No clean socks. Hen escaped into chapel. Left offering on altar. Not well received. 10. Brother Thomas from monastery next door tried to borrow ferret. Returned quickly. No explanation given. Cha. As you read, you realize you're reaching the end of an era. These pages span decades. Then, slow, the handwriting changes. The ink thins, and eventually, the ferret entries stop. Because, as all things do, the fashion of keeping sleeve. Ferrets faded, not abruptly, but slowly, gently, like a curtain, drawn 1 inch at a time. Several things contributed. For one, the rise of stricter religious reforms in the 16th century swept through many monastic communities. Like a spring cleaning, none of the sisters requested pets, especially those seen as distractions or luxuries, were quietly but firmly discouraged. Some orders went so far as to issue new rules stating that companionship must be found in prayer alone. You step into the convent's tailoring room, now abandoned for the night, but still fragrant with wool and beeswax thread. Spools of dyed linen sit stacked in corners, and a few unfinished habits hang from hooks. You notice something. The sleeves, they're narrower now, slimmer, more tailored, the kind of sleeves no ferret would tolerate or fit inside. That's the other reason. The practice faded. Fashion changed as the 15th century melted into the 16th. The wide, draping sleeves of earlier habits gave way to more streamlined designs. Practicality won out. It always does, eventually, and without those billowy pockets of space, the idea of sleeve living for a small creature lost its appeal and its feasibility. You drift through the hallways again, noticing with sharper eyes how the furniture has changed too. The nooks and corners where ferrets once dozed have become too tidy. The floor baskets are sealed. The drying racks are out of reach. Somewhere along the way, convents became quieter, still holy, still gentle, but a little less playful, a little more refined. Historians still argue whether this change was mourned or simply accepted. Did the sisters miss their ferret companions, or were they quietly relieved to have one less thing to trip over during matins? The records don't say, but personal letters, those rare glimpses into cloistered emotion, tell us something. One sister, writing to her cousin after a sweeping reform, lamented, "I do not complain of silence, nor fasting, nor the lack of meat on feast days, but I miss the weight in my sleeve. I miss the twitching nose." Another simply wrote, "My hands are empty." You return to the chapel one last time. Its candles burned low, its incense long faded. On one bench sits a habit, neatly folded, as if waiting to be passed to the next generation. The sleeves are narrow, crisp, impeccably stitched, and quietly unoccupied. The bell tolls midnight. You look around, half expecting a last-minute scamper, a final squeak, but nothing comes. And yet there's something carved into the underside of a pew, where only a crawling creature might see it, are the faint initials of a sister, and the simple outline of a ferret arched back, tail aloft. It's not large, it's not fancy, but it's there, a farewell, or maybe a promise. You exit the chapel slowly, the air cooler. Now, the convent asleep in full. The stars overhead flicker in their endless patience, and in the shadows, just before the door closes, you think you hear it faint, distant, impossible, the soft sound of paws on stone. The air outside the convent is cooler than you remember, touched by the faintest thread of morning breeze. You walk slowly beneath the archway, leading back into the main courtyard, the stars dimming softly as a pale blue begins to soak into the horizon. This, perhaps, is the hour the nuns love best, not yet burdened by the bustle of chores or bells, but gently cradled between darkness and day. You return to where your journey began, where the cloister walls wrapped you in their quiet rhythm, and the faint shuffle beneath a nun's sleeve first caught your curiosity. It's all still here, the soft echo of sandals on stone, the faint creak of wood, expanding in the cool isuli, and that lingering sense that somewhere, in some forgotten corner, a tiny creature might still be curled up in a habit pocket, dreaming of breadcrumbs and basil. The convent today feels lighter, not emptier, exactly, but transformed. In the centuries since the last official record of a sleeve-bound ferret, this place has continued to evolve. Some convents became schools, some became museums. A few remain active, sacred spaces for prayer and community, minus the paws and whiskers. And yet, the traces remain. You pass a painted fresco, half faded by time. Its subject is a familiar one. Saint Clare, holding a book of psalms, but if you tilt your head just right, in the folds of her robe, you notice an unexpected shape, small, furry, with a tail just mischievous enough to be deliberate. You laugh quietly. You can't help it. That's the magic of the mundane, when something as simple as a pet ferret becomes a lasting thread in the tapestry of history. Not because it changed the world, or led an army, or wrote a manifesto, but because it mattered, quietly, to someone who mattered. The final nun you pass this morning is sweeping the courtyard. Her robes are crisp, her sleeves narrow. Of course, sway gently as she moves. She doesn't look at you, but you notice a pin on her belt, a small, carved animal. It could be anything, really, but you know what it is. A nod, a memory, a sleeve ghost. So much of history gets swept away. Fire, flood, revision, time. But some things cling to the corners, not as headlines, but as warmth, as comfort, as the quiet company you didn't know you needed. You step through the last archway, where the first golden light slips down from the clouds, brushing the old stones with honey. The world beyond the convent is waiting, louder, yes, busier, but perhaps, just for today, you'll walk with your arms held slightly looser, just in case something small and fuzzy wants to crawl in and rest. You glance back one last time. The door swings gently closed behind you, and somewhere, whether in memory or in dream, you hear it again, the soft rustle of a sleeve. Now, if your eyes haven't already started to drift closed, let's slow things even further. Picture yourself wrapped in a warm woolen robe, seated on a stone bench warmed by morning sun. Around you, the garden buzzes faintly with bees. Doves murmur from the rooftop. And somewhere close, but not too close, you hear the snore of a very tired ferret. The scent of lavender wafts in with the wind. Someone has just lit the first morning candle, and the soft beeswax scent drifts across the courtyard, blending with the dew on the rosemary. It's peaceful here, unhurried. No one's asking you to do anything or be anywhere or solve anything at all. Your hands rest gently on your lap. Your breath moves in and out with the rhythm of a quiet hymn you don't quite remember learning, but somehow know by heart. Every part of you feels just a little heavier now, in the good way, the safe way. Even the stone beneath you seems to cradle you a little. Perhaps there's a small creature curled against your side now, warm, slightly twitchy in its sleep. You don't need to check. You can feel the heartbeat through your sleeve. You let your head tilt back and your shoulders soften. Everything sharp has smoothed out. Even time has decided to pause here for a while. The stars have faded from the sky, and yet you carry them still behind your closed eyes. You are safe. You are still, and somewhere in the stories between saints and silliness, you've found a place to rest. Let it stay with you now as you drift. Soft pause, soft breath, softer dreams. Sleep well.